Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome you all to Anecdotes and Arguments, how the color of individual life allows for broader interpretation of the Holocaust. An event in cooperation with the Institute for Human Science at the Sigmund Freud Museum in the Library of Psychoanalysis. It is a great pleasure to have Timothy Snyder here today, who must not be introduced in detail. He's an American historian, as you know, and well known by the number of his books published in 40 languages. He holds the inaugural Temerty Chair in Modern European History at the Munch School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. He is also a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and the head of the Academic Advisory Council of Ukrainian History Global Initiative. We also know him as a very active commentator on current global political developments via social media. And I would even describe him as a peace activist in the best sense of the word, because his strength as a pacifist lies in communication and dialogue. Timothy Snyder's statement will be followed by a conversation with Stephen Naron, director of the Fortunov Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, and he is also a fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences. Stephen Naron initiated and created, together with Judy Dawson and Ambros Hernadi, a wonderful documentary film for our current exhibition, Documents of Injustice, the Case of Freud. The film is called We Lived in the Ninth District, and it is based on selected testimonies from Viennese Holocaust survivors. When we walk past the exhibition space Schauraum Berggasse 19 in the street, we can hear the voice of these witnesses, and we can also see them recounting their childhood in Vienna before they were deported or forced to flee the Nazis. So Timothy Snyder and Stephen Naron will speak about this kind of knowledge transfer that connects individual experiences in the past with our present being. And they may also discuss the future potential inherent in such a dialogue between the present and the past. Please join me in warmly welcoming Timothy Snyder and Stephen Naron to Berggasse 19, the origin of psychoanalysis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind welcome. My whole life I've wanted to be in the Freud Museum looking down at people. Now that Freudian posture has been achieved. That's what you can offer to me. I hope to offer other things to you. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and with your team. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with people from my Toronto team, people from the Ukrainian project I'm working on, Stephen Naron, who is part of my Yale team, and we still work together in the Fortunov archive. What I'd like to do is speak to you for about 20 minutes or so about what testimony is and what it teaches us, and then Stephen and I will have a conversation of similar length, developing some of those themes. I want to begin with something that you as museum curators will know very well, which is that creation is a labor. Historians, when we look at sources, we often take them for granted. We walk into an archive and we think, yes, of course, this archive was given. It just existed. It grew like a tree out of the ground. Or a tourist visiting a museum can say, oh yes, this just exists. It's just here for me. But in every source, in every collection of curated sources, or every collection of curated objects, there's human labor. And in this moment where so much of what passes for human learning comes from pushing a button, or seems to come from pushing a button, I want to emphasize the significance, the underlying significance of that labor. And in the case of Holocaust testimonies, as those of you who have worked with them will know very well, these are a result of very specific human labor at a very specific time. There's nothing natural about the existence of Holocaust first-person sources. If they exist at all, it's because someone took a deliberate choice at a certain moment to bring them into existence, and then went through a process which is far from easy, which involves getting people to be interviewed, recording the interviews, deciding on what medium those interviews will be recorded, deciding how those things will be stored so that they can exist ideally for perpetuity, recognizing that when you made the wrong choice about that medium, that you have to change that medium so it can exist for perpetuity. There's labor and there's choice involved in the creation of these sources. And so before I even speak about what these sources mean and what they've meant to me as a historian, I just wanted to stress that point, that before we even get into talking about the sources, we have to recognize that those sources only exist because someone made them and chose to make them. So in the case of the Fortunoff archive for video Holocaust testimonies at Yale University, at a certain point in the 1970s, a group of people, mostly survivors, some not, made a deliberate choice to record testimonies on videotape. And that was one of the earliest efforts of this kind. And thanks to that effort back then, 50 years ago or so, among other things, we can be having that conversation. Thanks to that effort, I know Stephen knows me, the collection exists, we can have that conversation. Okay, so what are the purposes of these sources? What are the uses of these sources? Obviously, these kinds of sources, these first-person sources, whether video or audio or written, they recall an individual human being, and that, of course, is special and sufficient. They share with us that human being's sense of an experience. They help us to understand an experience. So they tell us that there was a life, but they also give to us a certain experience of that life. An interesting exercise is being carried out here in this museum, as you all know, where the lives of some Viennese Jewish women are being used to help us understand the experience of other Viennese Jewish women. And that is an interesting use to which such sources can be put. I hadn't thought of that before. And it's very fruitful, and I'm glad it's happening. So that's, I think, all more or less straightforward and not very controversial. What I want to suggest is that for me as a historian, these kinds of sources have a very different sort of significance, or an apparently very different sort of significance, which is that they help us to understand the causes of the Holocaust, how the Holocaust was actually possible, what brought it about, what advanced it. And before I get into this, I just want to stress that there is a certain tension between memory and explanation. Memory is perhaps less controversial than explanation. The Holocaust field tends in a kind of natural way towards memory and perhaps shies away a bit from explanation. For various reasons, memory is easier to respect and explanation is harder to accept. I just want to note that because I'm trying to make the point that in using these kinds of sources to explain, I'm doing something that perhaps not everyone had done, and I'm going to try to make the case that it's extremely helpful. So we obviously, I think it's obvious, we obviously should, or I'm going to claim, we should try to interpret the Holocaust, not just observe it, record it, remember it, but we should try to interpret it. We should have a sense of how it could happen, what the causes were, partly because if something like this happened, that means something like this was possible. And if something like this was possible once, then something like this is possible again. Not exactly like it, but something like it. if we try to interpret the Holocaust, it helps us to understand the people who we are. And I stress not just the Jews or the Germans or the Austrians, but the people who we are. It helps us to understand the actions we can take. And again, not just the actions that Germans can take or Austrians can take or Christians can take, but the actions that we as people can take. And although this might not seem obvious, and I'll try to make it clear as I go on, interpreting the Holocaust is also an exercise of empathy, because as we try to understand how it could come about, we stretch ourselves to understand people who we might prefer otherwise not to understand. And interestingly, it's the Jewish survivors who help us to do this. It's the testimony of Jewish survivors which allow us to see other people who were not Jews, who might have been behaving well, but more likely were not behaving well. So there's been a kind of debate about these sources. I'm standing in front of you and I'm going to claim that it's a central part of understanding the Holocaust to use the testimonies of Austrian Jewish survivors or other survivors. That has not been the normal position in Holocaust studies for much of the existence of Holocaust studies. For much of the time that there was the study of the history of the Holocaust, the normal position was the only permissible sources are the sources of the state, which in almost always meant the German state. When this began to turn, and it turned quite a bit with Charles Friedlander's very important book, it turned in the direction of German Jews. And I think very persuasively, Professor Friedlander made the argument that from the perspective of German Jews, one can understand the degradation of German politics and society in the 1930s. And that is, of course, entirely true. What I try to add in my own argument about the Holocaust, in my book Black Earth, is the perspective of Jews beyond Germany, starting in Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Baltic states, the Soviet Union, and so on. And there's a pretty clear reason why one should do this, which is that the vast majority of Jews killed in the Holocaust had nothing to do with German culture and didn't speak German. The vast majority of people killed in the Holocaust had no meaningful contact with Germany of any kind until they were killed by Germans or by people collaborating with Germans. And so those witnesses can tell us things which German Jews cannot tell us. What are some of those things that they can tell us? I brought a prop, and it's a bit of a time travel prop. So in this museum today, you have the testimony of, are you using last names here? Okay, of Erika Mandler, who is, I believe, one of 4 women who you're using in this exhibition. We're now in the year, I get a little confused about these things, but we're now in the year 2026, I believe. As a historian, I'm not responsible for that. I'm responsible for other things. So in the year 2012, Stephen can check me later, but in the year 2012, I read all of these sources in the Fortunoff archive. And in this book, which was published in 2015, I begin chapter 4 by citing Erika Mandler. I cite the one sentence, overnight, this was all overnight. And those of you who are Austrian, it's a prop, so I'm going to pass it around. Those of you who are Austrian will know probably what night she was referring to. So it's in my work, that particular testimony, as well as dozens of other testimonies from Fortunoff and a couple of hundred of testimonies in general, helped me to make a certain kind of argument about why the Holocaust was possible. And that argument has to do with the human understanding of other human beings. It has to do with a kind of capacity for empathy, not in the sense of liking the other person, not sympathy, but a capacity for understanding other humans. Isaiah Berlin, who was one of my teachers, used to argue that history was possible insofar as humans could see human commitments and human engagements in other humans in other times and places. And this is true inside the Holocaust sources. Let me give some examples of how Jewish first-person sources, Jewish testimonies, help us to understand how the Holocaust was possible and how the Holocaust actually took place. I'm going to give 4 kinds of examples of seeing other people and how Jews seeing other people help us to make arguments. The first has to do with rescue. Now, you might think rescue would be the easiest subject because all Jews, or almost all Jews who survived, were in contact with non-Jews who helped them. And rescue certainly seems like the subject which is easiest to narrate. It's very tempting to narrate, and much of the fictional material around the Holocaust presents saccharine or implausible accounts of rescue. What I find interesting and revealing in the Jewish material about rescue is how little the Jews actually understood why people were rescuing them. How difficult they found it to understand why people were rescuing them. And I realize that might meet with some resistance because one would like to think, well, of course they understood. These were nice people. They were good people. And often they were good people. But when Jews are asked this question, and I base this on having read pretty much everything I think that could be read or listened to in Polish and Yiddish, and German and some other languages, in general, when Jews were asked this question, they struggled. They struggled with why it was that somebody would rescue them. And this, I think, is very revealing. It's like the limits of seeing. It's a hard thing to explain, not an easy thing. And when Jews did come up with things, they were very often elemental, almost so elemental that they almost sound naive and impossible to accept, like hospitality. Or rather often, Jews would cite with mistakes, but recognizably, the parable of the Good Samaritan from the Christian part of the Bible, right? Where when you read it as a Christian, you can see what they're trying to say, and that they must have heard some version of it from the Christian who rescued them. But the story of the Good Samaritan and the idea that to be a neighbor is to show mercy is a very elemental explanation of why one would go about rescue. So I would actually say rescue shows, in a way, interestingly, the limits of seeing, that it shows us that rescue is much more mysterious than we would like it to be. A footnote to this is that because this is true, or among other reasons, because this is true, rescuers themselves were often also very inarticulate about why they rescued. In other words, the Jewish testimony is confirmed by the rescuers themselves when they are asked similar questions. They also tend to be very inarticulate about why they rescued. Not in Hollywood, I know, but in real life. And what this shows you, this is now a historical caution, is that rescuer stories where rescuers or supposed rescuers give a very clear account of their heroic motives are almost always not true. Okay. Second example. So the first example had to do with limits of seeing. The second example I would call seeing out of the corner of your eye. So this may not always be what we read these Jewish sources for, but if we do read them carefully and word for word or listen to them carefully, what we see or hear are non-Jewish victims of other German crimes. So there are other major German crimes against non-Jewish groups. For example, the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, which took about 3 million lives and was the second greatest, if that's the word, second largest German atrocity during the Second World War. Very weakly documented. There are only a handful of books about it for various reasons. But some of the primary sources on the German starvation of Soviet prisoners of war come from Jews who, in one way or another, saw these starvation facilities. They saw them because they themselves were imprisoned nearby. They saw them because they saw, as the Jews themselves were imprisoned, they saw a column of Soviet soldiers go by. But they were very often witnesses to that, and they're some of the few witnesses that we actually have to this enormous crime. A third kind of seeing, and it overlaps a bit with the second, is seeing what other people miss. And here I'm going to talk mostly about the vexing subject of collaboration. So in discussions of collaboration, it is very comfortable for people to say, my group did not collaborate. You may have confronted this. It is very comfortable for people to say, we didn't do it. It is also very comfortable to say that other ethnic group did it. And this is true, incidentally, regardless of whether you're Jewish or not. There is a temptation to say collaboration had to do with ethnicity. And whoever was around you, they probably did collaborate. But that doesn't mean that people collaborated because of ethnicity. Interestingly, so if you read the Jewish sources carefully, naturally, in the Jewish sources you have Polish anti-Semites and Ukrainian anti-Semites and Austrian anti-Semites and German anti-Semites and all kinds of anti-Semites. Of course you have that. But if you read them carefully, you also have Jews noticing some things that are a little bit more subtle, at least for us, or a little bit more likely to be overlooked, at least by us, which are other reasons for collaboration. There's a very specific, so I've already given you one example, which Jews noticed. If you were a Soviet prisoner of war and you were going to be starved and you were then released, you would probably collaborate. And so quite a few of the people we would classify as collaborators, local collaborators in the Holocaust, or Soviet or Russian or Belarusian or Ukrainian, were people who had been released from starvation camps, which is something which is, I would submit, pretty much lost from the general history of the Holocaust, but which is in the Jewish sources. But there are things that are more subtle than that, and that reveal the politics, or even more basically, the human character of collaboration. There's one very important phenomenon which we largely have from the Jewish sources, and that is the phenomenon of double collaboration. So people who collaborate first with the Soviets and then with the Germans. Now there are strong reasons why people don't like to see this, because if there's any inclination which is as comparable, which is as strong as saying my group didn't collaborate but your group did, it's the temptation to say, well, all of the evil was on one side of the political spectrum and none of it was on the other side, right? And so double collaboration is a phenomenon which generally people prefer not to see, although it took place on a very broad scale. Very often the policemen who come into view as German policemen in 1941 had just been Soviet policemen up until the day or the week before. And this is, of course, possible because the territories on which the Holocaust began, the Baltic states and Eastern Poland, had been occupied by the Soviet Union for almost 2 years before they were then occupied by Germany. And that whole phenomenon, incidentally, is also easy to overlook and to forget, that the Soviet Union was there first, the Germans were there second. Easy to forget because it's complicated, also easy to forget because perhaps we would prefer to believe that the war started in 1941 rather than 39. Perhaps we'd prefer to believe that the Soviet Union couldn't have had anything to do with it, right? It's certainly uncomfortable to think that the people who were working for the Soviets then immediately went to work for the Germans, which, when they could get away with it, they certainly did. And that is, of course, very human. Who noticed this? The Jews. If Ukrainians were working for the Soviet militia, and then those same Ukrainians went and volunteered for the Germans, they weren't going to be telling the Germans about this, obviously. The Germans thought they were recruiting people who were, when they recruited non-Jews, they thought they were recruiting reliable people. The Germans also had their limitations, and one of them was that they didn't understand that Slavs had brains. And so when Ukrainians came to them and said, oh yes, nice Germans, we would like to be in your police, the Germans didn't necessarily think these people probably just collaborated with the Soviets. But you know who knew that they did was the Jews, because the Jews were there. And so if you read Jewish testimony material, you'll see that. Not that the Jews are trying to make a point about it, they're just noticing a social phenomenon. And the thing is, if you think about it for even a moment, at a human level, that is 100% unsurprising. That is how human beings would behave, whether they're Ukrainians, Belarusians, it doesn't matter. Human beings who are collaborating with one regime are very likely to collaborate with another regime if they can get away with it, and it means they're going to preserve a job of relative security and power. That is how we are. But without the first person source material from the Jews, that rather obvious sociological reality might not occur to us. And of course, that complicates the picture, perhaps more than we would like, but it also makes the picture more true and therefore more helpful. Which leads me back to the fourth point, the final point that I want to make, which is seeing a political logic. And the political logic of the Holocaust is a logic of separation from the state. I'm not the first person to say this. Hannah Arendt made similar arguments from the very beginning of Holocaust studies. Raoul Hilberg made exactly this argument. It's been there from the beginning. I'll just spell it out. And as I spell it out, I'm not saying that anti-Semitism didn't matter. What I'm saying is that in addition to anti-Semitism, the ability of occupiers to separate people from the state enabled their killing. This is a point that I make at great length in the book. I won't go through the details here. I'll just note a couple of confirming examples. The death rates in the Holocaust are essentially proportionate to the degree to which the state was destroyed. So if you're looking for high death rates, they're in places like Poland and the Western Soviet Union, where the Germans declared the state not to exist and behaved accordingly. If you think it's anti-Semitism, you would then have to explain why in the Soviet Union and in Poland there were equal levels of anti-Semitism, which I assure you there were not. And then to give a minor example, the Holocaust in France. The largest victim group in the Holocaust in France were, in the Jewish Holocaust in France were, Who was the largest victim group in the Holocaust in France? Jews is correct. I was looking for a slightly more specific answer. Polish Jews. And the reason why not because there were more Polish Jews in France than French Jews, but because Polish Jews, in the Vichy government's understanding, were not citizens of any country, whereas French Jews were citizens of France. And so although it may seem ironic, being a citizen of a collaborating country is a much, much safer position than being regarded as stateless. So that kind of anecdote can be multiplied all the way through the history of the Holocaust, but the explanatory variable is statelessness. And this, I'm now going to read Erika Mandlow's testimony at greater length. This is something that she and her family immediately understood in the case of the 9th District, Vienna, Austria. I'll just read a couple of more sentences now from her testimony. It's, of course, about March the 11th, 1938. I must tell you, in our household on Friday night, or Shabbos, the radio was never played. But that night, the radio was turned on because we needed to know what was coming. And sure enough, we heard the speech of the then president of the country of Austria, Dr. Kurt von Schuschnigg, where he told the country that he is surrendering Austria to Hitler and the Germans. And when we heard that, my mother was just horrified. She, the first thing, and I remember this so well, she said, well, this is the end. This is the end for us. You cannot imagine the instant change in people. It seemed like the Austrians were ready for it. It seemed like the Austrians, policemen even had their banner in their pockets to put it on their arm and the big swastika. It hurt me as a child so terribly. How? My non-Jewish friends immediately were told that they couldn't play with me. They couldn't call me, and how they turned against me. And then I'm skipping ahead a bit. This all happened overnight. And that's the sentence I cite in the book. So, of course, what Erika Mandler is saying there gives you a sense of her life. Of course, it conveys an experience, but in addition to all of that, within what the woman is remembering as a girl, and what the family is understanding, there is also a political analysis, which is that whatever Austria had been until March 12th, or March 13th, 1938, it was going to be something else when the state of Austria ceased to exist. However imperfect, authoritarian, and so on Austria had been up to that point, if there was no Austria, things were going to be very different for the Jews, as indeed they were. And from that argument, from that bit of political analysis, you can not just make an abstract claim, you can then follow the rest of the Holocaust as it proceeds. Because, of course, the Holocaust, in the sense of killing Jews, only begins when the Germans start destroying states. And the first state that they destroyed was Austria. And if you notice what Erika Mandler and her family noticed, and you follow that same political logic, you then understand why the Holocaust accelerates in Czechoslovakia, accelerates in Poland, accelerates in the Soviet Union. So it's a longer argument to develop, but what I'm trying to say is that what might seem like even the most abstract high-level arguments about causation are things that are brought to mind by what Jews themselves noticed. So this, for me, is the point, or one of the points, of the labor of creating these sources. When I read that source aloud, of course there's the humanity and there's the experience and the possibility for memory, but there's also the possibility of considering these sources over and over again as we try to understand how such a thing was possible. Thank you very much.
Yeah, seems like it's working. Thank you, Tim. First off, I just wanted to thank Daniela and Monica and Peter at the Freud Museum for what was really an exceptional collaboration around the development of this film, which is downstairs. And if you haven't seen the film, please take the time to walk down the street and listen. This is not the first project that we've worked on together. We had a conference here about Dori Laub, a psychoanalyst and one of the founders of the Fortuna Video Archive, himself a survivor from Czernowitz. So it's really been a long series of fruitful cooperations, and so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to create the film and to invite Tim to speak to everyone today. Tim, you've been the faculty advisor at the Fortuna Video Archive now for 10 years. You took over after Jeffrey Hartman, also one of the founders and who fled Frankfurt on a Kindertransport, very well-known professor of comparative literature at Yale, had passed away, and you took on this responsibility of serving as a faculty advisor. It's been 10 years now. And I think we got a hint of how these sources have impacted your scholarship. But what I'd like you to talk about, if you're willing, is how it goes beyond your scholarship in Holocaust studies and how this archive has impacted other work that you've done outside of this space. I'm particularly thinking about the work on documenting Ukraine, which I don't know if any of you have heard of this project or familiar with the project, so I'd like you to say a few words about documenting Ukraine and what it is, but I'm more interested in hearing how the Fortuna Video Archive and your work as faculty advisor has or has not sort of impacted your thinking about this work.
I'm gonna start with the scholarship a bit, because it connects to everything else, and it's I can't really separate what other lessons I've learned from what I learned from the Jewish testimonies. One of the things the Jewish testimonies teach you is that there are more voices than you think because other people have gone to the labor of recording them. And if you put a little effort into it, you will find things that surprise you. So in Jewish studies or Holocaust studies and anything else, certain kinds of interpretations or certain kinds of voices naturally rise to the top because they don't offend anyone or because they're convenient, because for whatever reason they work in the culture at a given moment. And I think the natural temperament of a historian, and the other historians here can rise up and disagree, but the natural temperament of a historian is to think what is culturally convenient right now is probably not true. There's not much chance it's true, honestly, that what's culture, like what seems like the consensus that works in the culture at date A is very unlikely to reflect the actual events of date B. And the Jewish testimonial sources help, all sources help with that, but Jewish testimonial sources perhaps more than others, because the myths about causation or the attempt to dodge causation are answered in some sense by the sources, and also the myths or the misunderstandings about who the victims were is also answered by the sources. It's much easier to write about Germany because Germany is a big, important European country, and of course Germany was essential to the Holocaust. It's much easier if you're a historian of Germany to write about the German Jews because you know the German language, and like the German Jews, as a historian of Germany, your framework might be this was a great culture that was broken. But what if you're not a historian of Germany, and what if most of the Jews who died in the Holocaust had nothing to do with Germany? Then the sources from Austria help, and then the sources from Czechoslovakia and from the Soviet Union help. And although we may have fewer of those, in the Fortunoff archive we have all of those and much, much more. And those voices represent the voices of people who are less represented in the secondary literature and certainly in the dominant narratives about how the Holocaust happened. So that's part of it. Like, you're looking, as a historian, you're looking to question what seems obvious, because what's obvious is almost never true. And as a historian, you're looking to represent the event, and testimonies really help with that. And that leads me to some of the other ways that working with you in the Fortunoff archive, working with the Fortunoff archive has helped me. One of them that I shouldn't jump over is teaching. So in this era, which is more of a visual era, and in more of a narrative era, these sources are actually very accessible. In the last several years at Yale, I taught, I think, 4 different courses in which using these kinds of sources was part of the assignment. And of course, you don't have to be at Yale to do this. Many institutions have access to our material. And so this turns out to be you have to frame it, you have to set it up, but this turns out to be a good way to teach the Holocaust. And not only the Holocaust. So I use some of our sources to teach the year 1938. And I use some of our sources to teach years in European history where the Holocaust was one of the things that's on the horizon, but not the only thing. And then the third part, which you kindly alluded to, is that once you recognize all the work that goes into creating these sources, you realize even the most important things that are happening now are not really being chronicled. And we think they are because there's the news and there's the internet, but and maybe there's lots of Facebook posts and stuff is being recorded on people's phones, but chronicled in the sense of collected according to some logic and saved according to some principle where it's actually going to be durable, that doesn't really happen. And the internet is not going to save us in this respect. So without Fortunoff, I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't have had the idea, along with my colleague Kate Younger, to start this project documenting Ukraine, where our notion was to document the war while it was happening, using the voices, but also the disciplinary and professional skills of people who were in Ukraine at the time that it was happening. And in this way, we're generating hundreds of primary sources of various kinds of provenance, which we will then go to the trouble of trying to save, which, as you very well know, is a lot harder than it seems. So it's directly inspired me and colleagues to do these things.
Yeah, I would say, but more importantly, and I don't think this came out as clearly in the talk, was the idea of these sources as a counter to the state sources. You mentioned that, right? Testimony, first-person accounts as a sort of counterweight to other kind of sources for the Holocaust. But as with documenting Ukraine and the Fortunoff Video Archive, one of the more important elements I see is that it's also the individuals impacted by the war, impacted by the Holocaust, doing this documentation work themselves, right? So the Fortunoff Video Archive begins in '79 as a local grassroots effort, not at Yale, it's outside of Yale, it comes to Yale. And it's survivors themselves who are building this and doing this documentation specifically because their voice needs to be heard. And I feel like that seems to be, there's a corollary in the Documenting Ukraine project, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you for pulling that out. I want to make a related point about this. And again, it's a bit ironic, but one of the problems with the state sources, of course you have to use German state sources for the study of the Holocaust, but one of the problems with the German state sources is their thoughtlessness. This is one of Hannah Arendt's famous points, and I think she's right about it, that you can go through life doing certain kinds of things because you're not thinking, and the not thinking, and again, this is all Arendt, the not thinking means not seeing anything from the point of view of the other person, right? And so by thoughtlessness, I mean a very destructive kind of mindset. And so when you read German sources or German state sources, it's not just that they leave things out or they don't treat Jews as humans. It's that they're not helping you bring to life how people live. And ironically, the Jewish source material does a much better job with that. Very often you can see, as I tried to say, briefly in the talk, you can see the people we would call bystanders or collaborators or even perpetrators. You can see them in a more human light, right? Like this is a gift, it's an improbable gift that the testimony material gives to us because you can't see those interactions, you can't see those angles, you can't see the people often in the state sources. And very often, and those of you who've worked with these sources will know this, the Jews are actually trying to think because in order to survive, you have to think, right? You have to think, like, who can I trust? Who can I not trust? When should I do what? And that thinking is very often reflected in the testimony in a way that sources from the perpetrator side are not, right? The sources from the perpetrator side don't have to inquire that closely about local situations and the trustworthiness of other people for very obvious reasons. And so that's like another gift that's being given to us, is that people are thinking, and then, as you say, they take the trouble to remind us what happened to them. But also, especially when the questioner is good, you get access to what they were thinking at the time. And then I want to add an element which I think you suggested, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I want to bring out here. Recording testimony, people do it for various motives, and sometimes they tell you what some of their motives are in the testimony. But in addition to the fact that it's something that they do, like that it often came from the survivors themselves, I would point to the fact that it's really important for people to in some way do something about their trauma. And this is a point that I'm gathering day by day, really, from the war in Ukraine, where the scale, not just of death and maiming, but of sexual violence and torture is just horrifyingly great. And one is confronted with people who survive these things. And one of the things you notice is that, not that it's a happy ending or it's easy, But a way to address trauma is to do something which is somehow directly related to that trauma. It doesn't undo the trauma. It doesn't make it all better, but it's a sign of human agency to organize a project or to be able to speak about what's happened to you. And so it's a sign of human agency and strength, and I think that's also something which should be recalled.
No, absolutely, and I'm glad you raised that because I wanted to point to that as well. That, you know, for me, someone who's been working with this archive on and off now for 20 years, the Fortune Video Archive is an incredible source, and we talked about what can these sources show us, right? But that's not really the primary intention of an archive of this kind, which is in the Fortune Video Archive, the act of recognition, the act of empathy, that the opportunity for a survivor to be heard for the first time in many cases, to tell their story and to have an empathic listener on the other side. Not necessarily to relieve the trauma, because we know that giving testimony can re-traumatize the survivor, but certainly Dory Laub, as a psychoanalyst who founded this project, was thinking along these terms. But that the act of providing or creating the labor of creating the testimony itself is almost, if not more important than the idea of its future use as a source. Mm-hmm. And that's another area where I see the Documenting Ukraine project a similarity, right? And for you who don't know about the Documenting Ukraine project, it's first and foremost, it's a project where hundreds and hundreds of micro grants have been given to academics, journalists, artists, photographers, natural scientists. It's multidisciplinary to do the work under wartime conditions of gathering a piece of the puzzle of the story of this war, and the fact that will be an archive someday and serve as a source of research, to me always is wonderful, but it seems secondary, really secondary. The fact that you all have made these resources, these funds available as a lifeline to these scholars and creators is an act of solidarity worthy of, if that was it, we'd be genug, that'd be enough, right? So that's another point that of connection.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. Yes, I agree, but there's a kind of happy way that the two things work together where, yes, people are happy to be able to, I'm talking about the Documenting Ukraine project now, people are happy to be able to do the things they're good at, right? So one of the things we do in this project is, and this is actually not obvious, we're not coming in as Westerners and saying this is how you record an atrocity. We literally have no guidance about that at all. What we say is, you're a photographer, you're a zoologist, you're an archivist, you're a librarian. You submit your proposal to us of how you, according to your own inclinations and skills, would document it. And then we say yes and we give you money. So we are not telling people how to do it. We are allowing them to be them as they do it. We're allowing them to do what they're good at. And that is quite radically different from how this kind of thing is often done, where the Western grant-giving institution knows best and they have protocols and so on. And I just want to stress that, not because it shows how wise we are, but because it affirms your point in a way that it's not just that we're funding them, we're letting them do the work that they're good at. But then the other part of it, the self-affirming part, is that you're right, it has an inherent significance, but the fact that people know that it's going to be recorded, that also empowers them, right? Because it says, okay, I'm not just doing the thing that I'm capable of. This is going to be there in 5 years or 10 years when people try to understand this terrible war.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we'll open it up for a few questions from the audience. So it's the first time that I know of that the Fortune Video Archive has a short film displayed in such a public place, right? I mean, the idea of it is that it's an intervention in sort of the daily daily environment on Berggasse. You walk down the street and you see this space where there's a video playing, and you move closer and you can hear them speak, and they're talking about the city around you at a very different time. And it seems to me that, you know, in the arena of public history, education, memorialization, around the topic of the Holocaust, that we're seeing a sort of dramatic shift. It also depends on, you know, not one dramatic shift, but dramatic shifts, right? Because every place is different. But here in Vienna, here in Austria, there is an openness that may not have always been there in the past due to how they dealt with this history, to have these type of public engagements, right? That this is a welcome intervention on the part of the Freud Museum. Might not have been that way 20 years ago or 15 years ago. Hard to say. But in other places, there seems to be a kind of deep anxiety in our culture that there is a shift, that Holocaust memorialization, Holocaust scholarship, Holocaust memory is disappearing, and with that disappearance, that is with the end of the era of the living witness, people who you can speak to, who you know, who you can invite into a classroom, that we're reaching some kind of inflection point, and that this past will inevitably be forgotten and become irrelevant. And so, can you discuss, you know, how much of this is just a natural sort of evolution of, you know, time passes, and how much of this is a reflection of some crisis that we feel we're entering, some sort of era of crisis, right? If we need the living witnesses to help teach us to be humane, to fight anti-Semitism, to deny fascism a space in which it can thrive, you know, what's happening, and why is there this anxiety about the end of the living witness?
And that's a really deep question, and maybe we could even have another question for you after it, because my answer is going to be inadequate. I've got a few thoughts about it, and so I've been writing. So I'm a historian who wrote about the Holocaust. I wrote two big books. One was partly about the Holocaust, one was entirely about the Holocaust. There was a period of about 10 or 12 years when I was working very intensely on the Holocaust, and then I deliberately moved on to other subjects. What I want to note is that during that period when I was intensely engaged writing about the Holocaust, and when I gave on the order of 200 lectures that had to do with the Holocaust, this was indeed the atmosphere, and some version of this question was very often asked. And I will tell you, like, my thoughts about it when I was confronted with it. The first thought that I had is that we're confusing memory with, we're putting the burden on people. We're putting a burden, an impossible burden, on people, and that this is a result not of the care for history, but actually the indifference to history. That to me as a historian, it was a sign that we were becoming less and less able to make sense of the past on the basis of written sources and so on. And therefore, we become anxious because we believe our only connection to the past is going to be these people. So behind that anxiety, one of the things I sensed was that we were losing touch with history, or losing faith in history, or something like that. The second thing that struck me, and as you've gathered, and as you've gathered, I believe the Holocaust should be understood. I believe that we should be trying to understand it as well as remember it. And I think it's important, and this was the thesis of my talk, to recognize that when we try to understand it, we're also remembering. The conversation has tilted very, very, very far, as I see it, in the direction of memorialization as opposed to history. And they're not the same thing. They barely overlap. I mean, they make contact, but they're not at all the same thing. And the problem when you tip all the way towards memorialization is that if memorialization consumes history, then eventually it's not standing on anything because it can't create its own basis. Memorialization has to be based on history. And if you're losing faith in history, if you don't trust history, or you're not writing fresh interpretations, then you end up saying, well, you Holocaust survivor, it's all on you. You have to bear the burden of all the interpreting, all the explaining. And and I had these experiences, and you've had too, but like the Holocaust, I've taught classes and so on with Holocaust survivors, and you feel that like the burden is on that one person to convey the emotions of it, to convey the causes of it, to do all the work of it. And it's an impossible burden, and it's an impossible burden whether you're alive or not, honestly. I mean, it was already an impossible burden is what I'm trying to say. And so, of course, like there's an indescribable trauma of the last witnesses going. But at the same time, it may be a reminder to us that living witnesses are not the main way we have understood the past, and that human beings leave behind other kinds of traces for us besides the things that they have to tell us over and over again. So there's that. And then the final thing I wanted to say is that the traces that people leave behind can be used in various different ways. And taking your point that the effort of creation of these sources can be seen as more important than the uses to which we put them. Nevertheless, the example that I gave is only one example of how these sources can be used creatively. In Stephen's period of curating this collection, we've done things with these sources. I mean, the film is an example, but Stephen has a podcast series. He's gone to great, not him personally, podcasts that are based on our sources. Stephen's gone to great effort to extract the music that is in the sources, and there is music in the sources, and then have that music performed and recorded. You can use these sources creatively to create new genres. This will seem perhaps less exciting than the podcast and the film, but we've been publishing, get ready for it, this is going to be very exciting. We've been publishing translations and annotations of these sources. So that, because if you've read Holocaust testimonies, they're mentioning some village, they're mentioning this and that, and you don't know what it is, and it's spelled 5 different ways. So we are taking historians who know various languages, and we're having them read and explain the sources, annotate them, and turn them into essentially a primary source and a secondary source so that you can follow what's going on. And we're doing this like one by one by one, but that's another thing one can do with these sources. There's a lot that one can do with the traces that people leave behind. And in that sense, they're inexhaustible.
No, I thank you for that. I agree. And, to me, this anxiety, it seems to be tied up with sort of many different things, including political developments and conflicts around the world. But we also have to remember that in 1979, when the founders of this archive got together to do this, they also had different motivation that they already felt at this point that the history of the Holocaust, the survivors were slipping away in 1979, right? The last living witnesses were slipping away, and we had to record them before it was too late. And that the memory of the war was fading, and that politics, democratic backsliding, and things in the United States, the rise of neo-Nazism then was also a motivating factor behind doing this work. And so I think that anxiety then and anxiety now are sort of tied together. But having the living witness to me seems, or the desire to sort of encase them in amber and never let them let them die is an unnatural reaction. And in fact, we see this in the sort of digital world where you have these efforts to create sort of automated sort of chatbot-like interactions between based on interviews with survivors. And to me, that seems like an anxiety of encasing these people in amber forever, whereas we have an archive like the Fortunate Video Archive and hundreds of thousands of testimonies, and that should be enough for the work of writing history and memorialization.
We should open this up to questions. I'll just add one word, and that is, it does come down a bit to empathy, because when we want the survivors to explain everything to us, we're essentially in the consumer position. I mean, we might be listening respectfully, and hopefully we are, but we're putting ourselves in a kind of position where it's their job, and we think of ourselves as being good because we're listening. But I would submit that's not really enough, that you have to be reaching out halfway towards the source, whether it's a living person or whether it's a written text. And that this is one of the things that makes history hard, that we have these sources, but when you listen to a scratchy videotape from 1982, where the person asking the questions is constantly interrupting the person who's trying to explain things, and you have to pay attention, right? You've got to have empathy. You have to go halfway. And the same is true with if there's a transcript or any other kind of written source. Like, you as the reader, you have to make an effort. You've got to go halfway into that source. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that's always true, whether people are alive or not. You have to go, you have to pull something out of yourself. You have to be prepared to be surprised, to not hear the thing you thought you were going to hear. And if you have that, then there are, as you say, then there are going to be enough sources.
That's a fantastic way to segue into a few questions from the audience. We'll take, I think, 2. Is that okay? If time allows? All right. Yeah. Do we have a microphone for the? Okay, go ahead.
Let this gentleman go first, and then I'll.
Okay.
Right, this man right here. You're on. Go.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, thoughtful presentation. I have 1.5 questions, and that is.
Moment.
Now you have to reduce it to 1 question since you had 1.5.
So 1.5 questions. Thank you very much once again for this very thoughtful and provocative and important presentation, which I think everyone here loved and enjoyed. There are at least two testimonial sources. One is the source that you mentioned, and that is the source from survivors and their memories. The other source, I guess, is the one that was contemporaneously produced, such as Klemperer's diaries or the diary of Anne Frank, and I guess that there are others. To which extent, what is the difference between these two sources? I understand that there are very few of those that I mentioned, but they do exist. And what is the difference there? And when I think of Klemperer's LTI, the Lingua Tertii Imperii, then many of the things that, the first questions you raised is, how could the Holocaust happen? And isn't it that the published sources, it's not the state sources, but the published sources from media, that they already paved the way, Lingua Tertii Imperii, that they already paved the way towards something that goes into annihilation?
Do you want to say something about that, Stephen?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, why don't you go first?
Well, so that's a great question, and it's a question that I think a lot about, actually. And it's important that the Klemperer is just one example, but there are indeed thousands and thousands of sources, contemporaneous sources, and sources of the victims in particular, testimonies, reportage, annals, chronicles, diaries written in the ghettos, in the camps. I'm thinking, one of the most well-known is the Oynik Shabbos archive, which is the Emanuel Ringelblum project, where there are, we're talking about, thousands of sources. And they are just as important, of course, as anything afterwards. But I fail to see, I dislike the sort of division of these sources along the lines of temporality exclusively, because what I have seen from reading both the Ringelblum sources, or let's say the thousands of testimonies taken in the immediate post-war period in the displaced persons camps, is that there is a common thread between many of these testimonies, and that in fact, even though the video archive is 79 and these are very belated, that the similarities between the content is quite shocking. And that the fact is, one of the most important things we get from these sources, of course, is how it felt, right? Not necessarily the facts, the detailed facts of when this transport left this, but how it felt to be caught up in this whirlwind. And the pain of this, of that experience doesn't seem to temper over time. Like, this idea of time heals all wounds seems to be completely refuted by looking at these testimonies, both during, immediately after, and so late in belated testimony at the Fortunoff Video Archive. So yes, they're different, but I see a lot more similarities than I think others might.
Okay, so a few more thoughts about this. There are more categories that you could come up with. So there are memoirs. There are a few, but there are diaries of Jews, survivors and also not survivors. We have a few diaries of Jews who didn't survive, of course. And then there are memoirs that were written, so not testimonies, but memoirs that were written afterwards. We have quite a few of those. And then there are analyses by people who, for whatever reason, didn't touch the subject for a long time, often in an East European setting where the concept of the Holocaust or the lexicon of the Holocaust wasn't present. A good example of that is Michał Głowinski, who was a Polish Jewish survivor. Who people didn't know he was Jewish until he wrote his memoir, which was called Black Seasons, or Czarne Sezony. And I think of Głowinski in connection with your question because Głowinski, like Klemperer, was a student of language, and he was known for writing a book which was very much like Klemperer's book, but it was about communism rather than about National Socialism. And then later in life, he wrote his memoir of surviving the Holocaust, which I recommend to you, Black Seasons. The problem, so I like Klemperer and I learn a lot from him. A similar point I would make about Anne Frank, but Klemperer is writing very much within the broken civilization paradigm. And so one can see, and he's right, about the changes in how words are used, and his observations about how German behavior changes are very telling. That takes us so far in the analysis of the Holocaust, but no further, because much of the Holocaust is going to take place well beyond Germany, and it's going to be perpetrated by Germans who, when in Germany, are actually going to behave much better than when they are outside Germany. It's going to be perpetrated by police units that, when they're inside Germany, are going to behave one way, but when they're in Ukraine or Belarus, are going to behave another way. And I don't think you can get from Klemperer to that. I think you need more radical explanations that involve what it's like for there to be complete destruction of the state, colonization policies, total deprivation of rights to everyone. So where I would disagree is the paving the way part, because in my reading, and I read German and I read all the books and so on, but I'm not a historian of Germany. I'm a historian of Eastern Europe. And the way that the debate seems to me to have gone is that the parameters of what caused the Holocaust were very much set by the period of 1933 to 1938, which is when the Holocaust didn't happen. And so some of the causes come from that period, but some of them must come from later. And the sources tend to come from Germany, which is not actually where the Holocaust happened. I mean, you can extend the boundaries of Germany into Poland and include the annexed territories of the Reich, and then, of course, Auschwitz is inside the boundaries of Germany, right, as is Helmno. But the Holocaust doesn't happen in pre-war German territory. Terrible things happen, camps happen, Jews are killed, Jews commit suicide, but not the Holocaust. And so in terms of both time and space, you need witnesses that are from other places. And for various reasons, we don't have that many people who are in a position to write with the kind of depth that Klemperer wrote with. I mean, the very fact that he could survive, like his survival position, basically impossible outside Germany. There weren't that many Latvian Jews who were surviving because of who their spouse was. So his very position, I mean, one doesn't want to use the word privileged, but his very position is quite different. And those chronicles then, I think, play a slightly disproportionate role. So how I feel about that's I mean, I admire Klemperer, I use him, I cite him, but what I feel about that source is that we have to push back a little bit from the experiences of other times and places. And it's precisely first-person testimonial sources where we get some of the material to do that.
So should we wrap up, or Daniela? One more question.
Hello, I'm a historian, and one of the things that I go back a long way to the era of oral history, and the profundity of this discussion is very impressive to me. I'm very pleased and impressed by the level at which this conversation is happening. But I'd like to take us a little bit back to the level of the ordinary student who is encountering this stuff for the first time, and may, in fact, in school have, at least in Austria, have encountered an approach to history that is still very positivistic. Facts, period. And the ocean of Quellenkritik, as they put it in German, yes, the critical assessment of sources, is very strange to many students. They hadn't learned it in school. And there's a fundamental conflict here. It's part of what Timothy was already saying between history and memorialization. Because in memory politics, the critical assessment of sources plays no role at all. It's about canonization of a particular set of statements. Not always factual, but interpretive also. Whereas historians are always trying to ask, where did the source come from? Who's producing it? What's going on? And that doesn't mean that the person involved, the person providing testimonies is somehow saying things that aren't true, but it's a different way of framing the information that you're getting. And back in the day, when we were first encountering the oral history and critically debating about the value of his testimonies, an example from Auschwitz came up even before the idea of collecting Holocaust testimonies was even in the room. A lot of these people who were at Auschwitz were using Mengele. They were saying Mengele's name as though he had done the whole selection process on the ramp. And this was simply not possible. The man didn't work 7 days a week, and he wasn't the only one doing the selections. So what do we make of that? How do we explain that to people without becoming relativists of some kind?
Okay.
Okay. Well, I congratulate you for being a relativist of no kind. I think it's hard not to be a relativist of some kind, right? Like when you choose ice cream, some ice cream is better than other ice cream. And
Of course.
oh, I'm sorry. Okay, let me have my little moment before I get to your question. You can think some things are better than others without thinking that something is absolute. So with source critique and positivism, I'm going to make a point which I'm sure is obvious to you. What is deserving of Quellenkritik and what is just fact is very often a matter of nationalism. So when I think back to the troubled times of the debates over the Holocaust of the late 1980s in the German-speaking world, it's very striking that Jewish sources are subject to overwhelming Quellenkritik, right? Because, as we know, Jews are very emotional, and since they survived this terrible thing, they're probably even more emotional. So, and that's my Quellenkritik, and we don't have to. And this is a fair summary. I'm not actually being polemical. Whereas, as we know, Germans are very reliable, and they always write everything down that they did, and so therefore, German state sources are not subject to Quellenkritik. They're just factual, reliable. And the thing you're calling positivism very often depends upon some kind of prior national or racial prejudice, right? So the notion that Germans are orderly is something that I, as a historian, can tell you is actually not true, especially when it comes to like keeping things like archives. They're really not that great. And the fact that we think that they are is a sign of our own racial prejudice, right? Like everyone in the East European field, everyone thinks, oh, well, the German archives, they must be so much more orderly than the Soviet ones, but the opposite is the case. The opposite is the case. And so often I'm expanding your question a bit, but what qualifies as being just the facts or as being the kind of source that we can use in positivism, I think very often has a racial and national background before you even get to it. And so when I think of those, when I think of the Historikerstreit, I remember the young Shel Friedlander, or the much younger Shel Friedlander, who was like, as a Jew, was just like barely allowed to take part, because if you look back at the Historikerstreit, there are many funny things about it. But one of them is how incredibly Germanocentric it is, and how East European voices and even Jewish voices are just basically not present. But there's a little intervention by Friedlander at one point where he says, basically he just says, I think maybe we could listen to some of the Jewish voices. That's it. That's all he says. And he's been surrounded by this, he's been surrounded by like the positivismus, he's like, and he's just saying, I've been a Jew my whole life, and like I've been a historian for a while, and I think maybe some of these Jewish sources are okay. That's it. That's all he's saying. And that's like as far as it goes in the late 80s, at least as I'm reading it. I mean, I was a kid then, and I kind of became a historian because of the Historikerstreit. I was reading it while it was happening, and I found it fascinating, and that's one of the things that drew me into the field. So I'm just trying to say that like one way to confront this thing you're calling positivism is to do a kind of history where everybody's subject to critique, right? Because of course it's true, and like Stephen and I could multiply the anecdotes of how survivors sometimes get things wrong, or they confuse one thing with another thing. And remember, often survivors are people who were taken from one country to another country, and so unsurprisingly, they may have mistaken ideas of where they were. It happens, right? And there are various other things that happen to these sources, but they're not more subject to Quellenkritik than other sources are, right? Like, and if we can establish that equality between Jewish sources and Polish sources and German sources, and kind of recognize that all of them have problems and do Quellenkritik together, then I think we end up with a much better version of history. So that's how I feel about these subjects. In using them to teach kids, you should be careful about which one you use, and you wouldn't want to say, hey kids, this is the unvarnished truth. You would want to set, as is done, you want to set Erica M's testimony in some context. You want to put them in some sort of context. But what you don't want to do is set up the Jewish sources as being subject to Quellenkritik, whereas the German sources are not subject to Quellenkritik. You want to make sure that people understand that. And on positivism, one final thought. Positivism is often a way to not get into the kinds of subjects that Freud was interested in. Like, it's a way to dodge those moments of insight, which I was trying to suggest that the Jews sometimes had, right? Like, not only Jews, obviously, other people give us these insights too. But that moment where you see the thing which you can't empirically prove, but which is going to be true. Like when Erikamanda's mother says, like, this is the end for us. She's seen something in a moment of insight which is correct. She couldn't go out and like collect all the data, and write the report. But the positivism in the sense of being attentive to all the facts, yes. But also one of the things that voices give us is these moments of insight, right? Like of human insight, which by history, which is a little too positivist, will sometimes miss. Okay.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that.
Oh,
Tim.
okay, all right.
But I agree wholeheartedly, and yes, I think it's shocking. It's still shocking to me that almost every time we do some sort of presentation on testimonies and sources, this question of historical veracity sort of jumps up, and thinking that these debates have been discussed ad nauseum and sort of crushed in the 1980s and 90s, but they keep reemerging, and I don't have an answer for that, except that every generation has to sort of reestablish these sources as valuable. And it's unfortunate that it has to be done, but like you said, no source except for first-person accounts, diaries, memoirs, can provide the type of insight, as Tim said, of what it felt like to be there. We don't need Holocaust testimony to write the history of the Holocaust necessarily, although it helps dramatically, but we can't understand what it was like to be caught up in this experience without listening to these voices. And so that's just as important as a sort of, German national sources or whatnot, as sort of somehow less in need of Quellenkrieg, which of course I don't agree on.
But like, so I am someone, I'm a historian. I'm very critical of these sources. I'm just not more critical of them than I am of other sources, right? So in the Fortunoff, when I started working in the Fortunoff, there's this nice guidance, I don't know if we still have it, but which says, please be respectful of these sources and use them in the way they were intended. And as a historian, I say, no, and as a human, but as a historian, I think, no, these are sources. And I'm going to read them with the same level of respect and the same level of critique I would use for any other sources. And if you do that, you're actually treating people respectfully. Like if you put them in amber and you treat them as being flawless, you're treating them as not being human. But if you read them respectfully, but also with the same kind of caution and the same kind of attention you give to other sources, then you're being respectful. And then at the end of the day, taking Stephen's point and agreeing with it completely, that only first-person sources give you experience, and only a first-person source can bring back a person, right? Like in some way, the film brings back people. In some way, even talking about them brings back people. In some way, when I read the words or you read the words, it brings back a person. Only a first-person source can do that. But in doing history, what you do is you juxtapose the first-person source with another first-person source from somewhere else, with a state source, right, with something else. You juxtapose these things together, and then you get a picture which is bigger and different than the picture that any one person could have had, whether it's the German or whether it's Ukrainian or whether it's the Jew. And then you find yourself, thanks to these sources, understanding, right? And that's an understanding in a way that you couldn't without them. And that's important too.
Great, that's a great ending. Everyone, let's thank Tim for his presentation.
Oh, well, thanks, Stephen, too. Yeah. Okay, thank you all very much.